The Torah is asking us whether or not in our lives we will always and no matter what feel allegiance to the higher level mission, the higher level obligations that God and the Jewish tradition have laid out before us, that we understand through our study of our heritage and of our sources and of our sacred literature. In this week's Parsha, Toldot, the God of Abraham speaks to Isaac, the leader of the next generation, metonymic for every new generation that would come as part of Am Yisrael, the family of Israel through history, and explained, Ekev asher shama Avraham b'koli, because Abraham obeyed my voice. The first half of verse 5 of chapter 26 says that Abraham heard the voice of God within. What is that voice of God that rings true in our lives? Are we expecting some transcendent God to blare a message through massive speakers on a mountaintop? Is it an amplified kind of communication? Or does it make more sense when we think about the communications we have with the divine presence to align ourselves with that voice of God deep within our souls, our hearts, and our minds? Abraham, like each person, is an individual. Each person has leadership capacity. Each person has a part in the Jewish mission. Hears God's voice and knows through having a moral compass pointed in the right direction just what kind of life journey to move on with, despite the hardships and despite the challenges and in light of the tests, makes meaning of each of the struggles and makes meaning in each of the challenges that he faced. We too, same. We are pointed in a moral direction and in what we would consider the right Jewish thing to do. We can call that God's voice, either whispering or sometimes shouting within our earshot through the soul fiber we have as part of this eternal people. The second half of verse 5 of chapter 26 reads that Abraham, Vayishmor mishmarti mitzvotai chukotai v'torotai, that Abraham observed my safeguards, my commandments, my edicts, and my Torahs. In Hasidic literature, Abraham is well known as having fulfilled mitzvot even before the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. That was already found in rabbinic sources where a portrait of Abraham who kept rabbinic mitzvot comes into focus. Why the projection onto Abraham of the ancient world? This way of living, this systemic way of living, this mitzvot structure, this structure of what are called Torot, lessons that God taught Abraham. Because the rabbis and commentators throughout the Middle Ages into the modern period, when we talk about the Hasidic texts I mentioned, we talk about the 19th century, 20th century texts after the foundational ones of the 18th century. They were looking towards a life of discipline among all peoples of the world everywhere, that Jews should have a not only moral compass, but a mitzvah compass in order to live their lives. Rashi, on that second half of verse 5 in chapter 26, explains that Shema Avraham b'koli Abraham obeyed my voice, that was more the voice of deriving meaning after major tests. Kasheni sitioto. After I tested Abraham, that servant of mine, God says, truly listened to the messages and the meaning and the implications of all of the trials and tribulations that he went through. But when it comes to the second half of the verse, mishmarti and mitzvot and chukot and torot, the safeguards, the commandments, the edicts, the Torahs, that, Rashi says, refers to gzeirot, decrees, leharchaka, decrees that would be fences around Torah, in addition to the specific mitzvot themselves, so that there was a distancing, a healthy distancing between the righteous path and the possible transgression. Al azharot shebetorah. For all of the negative commandments in the Torah, there was a sense, a morally virtuous and righteous sense of distancing oneself from the distasteful to the sinful. And Rashi gives an example, kagon shniot la'arayot. It's not only the big serious offenses when it comes to illicit sexual relations, but even guarding against any inclination of sexual impropriety. That one builds fences, that one builds boundaries in order to keep a focus on righteous paths and righteous playing fields of one's life. This, coming at the beginning of the Parsha, sets not only Abraham into great light, but Isaac, who is symbolic of generations to come, all Jewish people for all future times, that we would have to hear within us the voice of God, and also then understand and study the various laws and how they are explicated by our sages, and understand the teachings and what their purposes are in order to create more righteous playing fields for us in our lives.